You think you know war? You think you've seen comebacks? Let me tell you about the 5 minutes that saved America and changed the entire course of World War II. And most people have no idea it even happened. June 4th, 1942. The Japanese Empire is crushing everything in its path. Pearl Harbor's still smoking in everyone's memory. The Philippines have fallen, Singapore's gone, and it looks like Japan's gonna own the entire Pacific Ocean. Their navy's undefeated, their pilots are the best in the world, and they're sailing toward a tiny speck of coral called Midway with the biggest fleet ever assembled, ready to deliver the knockout punch that'll force America to surrender. But here's what the Japanese don't know. The Americans are reading their mail. Every battle plan, every ship movement, every secret communication, decoded. And 3 American aircraft carriers are hiding over the horizon, waiting to spring the ultimate ambush. What happens next is so dramatic, so against the odds, so perfectly timed that if you saw it in a movie, you'd say it was unrealistic. We're talking about the moment when American dive bombers come screaming out of the sky, catch 4 Japanese carriers with their pants down, and in 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes, sink 3 of them and turn the invincible Japanese Navy into burning wreckage floating on the Pacific. This isn't just another war story. This is about codebreakers working in basement offices who outsmarted an empire. This is about torpedo bomber pilots who flew suicide missions to create an opening they'd never live to see. This is about one American admiral making a gutsy call to trust intelligence over caution, and one Japanese admiral making a fatal hesitation at the worst possible moment. This is the battle where everything changed, where Japan went from unstoppable offense to desperate defense, where America went from reeling victim to advancing powerhouse. And if you don't know this story, you don't understand how close we came to losing the Pacific, or how courage, intelligence, and split-second decisions can literally change the fate of nations. Picture this. It's December 7th, 1941, and the sun's barely up over Hawaii when all hell breaks loose. Japanese planes are screaming out of nowhere, turning Pearl Harbor into an absolute inferno. Ships are exploding, sailors are jumping into burning water, and America's Pacific Fleet is getting absolutely demolished in less than 2 hours. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto just pulled off what seemed like the perfect surprise attack, right? But here's the thing that's going to haunt him for the rest of his life. He didn't finish the job. Those American aircraft carriers, they weren't even there that morning. They were out at sea, safe and sound, and that's going to come back to bite Japan hard. Now let me tell you something about Yamamoto that most people don't know. This guy wasn't some mindless warmonger screaming for American blood. Actually, he'd studied at Harvard, traveled across the United States, and he knew exactly how powerful America's industrial machine could be if it got fired up. He'd literally told Japanese leadership, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, I have no expectation of success." That's not cockiness. That's cold, hard realism from a man who understood he was playing with fire. But Japan's military leadership didn't want to hear it, and they pushed forward anyway, believing their samurai spirit would overcome America's industrial might. So what's going through Yamamoto's head after Pearl Harbor? He's sitting there knowing he's just kicked a sleeping giant right in the teeth, and now he's got to figure out how to knock it out before it wakes up fully. The problem is, those carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, they're still out there, floating around the Pacific like ghosts waiting to strike back. And in 1942, carriers are everything. They're the new kings of naval warfare, making those massive battleships look like dinosaurs. You control the carriers, you control the Pacific. Lose them, and you're done for. The Japanese Empire's riding high in early 1942, though. I'm talking unstoppable momentum. They've taken Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, most of Southeast Asia. It's like watching a tsunami of military conquest sweeping across the map. American forces are getting pushed back, British colonies are falling like dominoes, and to the average person watching newsreels back home, it looks like Japan might actually win this thing. The Imperial Japanese Navy's got the best trained pilots in the world, the most experienced carrier crews, and they've got everyone convinced they're invincible. But that confidence, that's going to be their downfall. Here's where Yamamoto's strategic problem gets real interesting. He knows, absolutely knows, that America's got factories pumping out ships, planes, and weapons at a rate Japan could never match. Henry Ford's assembly lines aren't just making cars anymore. They're cranking out B-24 bombers faster than Japan can shoot them down. The Kaiser shipyards are launching Liberty ships by the dozens. Yamamoto's doing the math in his head, and the numbers don't lie. Every month he gives America to build up strength is another nail in Japan's coffin. Time's not on his side, and he knows it better than anyone. So, what's his solution? Go big or go home. Yamamoto decides he's got to lure out those American carriers and destroy them in one massive, decisive battle. He's thinking like a chess player trying to force checkmate before his opponent can rebuild their pieces. And the bait he chooses? A tiny speck of coral and sand right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Midway Atoll. It's not much to look at, just a couple of small islands with an airstrip, but it's strategically positioned like a dagger pointed at Hawaii. If Japan takes Midway, they can threaten Pearl Harbor directly and force the Americans to come out and fight on Japan's terms. Now, imagine you're an American sailor or pilot in those early months of 1942. Your buddies died at Pearl Harbor. You've watched Japan steamroll across the Pacific. Every news report sounds worse than the last. The Japanese military seems unstoppable, and you're wondering if you're even going to make it home alive. But here's what's happening behind the scenes that nobody knows yet. American intelligence officers are working around the clock in basement offices in Hawaii, hunched over radio intercepts, doing something that's going to turn this whole war upside down. They're breaking Japanese codes piece by piece, message by message. Yamamoto's putting together the biggest naval armada Japan's ever assembled for his Midway operation. We're talking about 145 ships, including 6 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, though the last 2 won't make it to Midway. These aren't just any carriers. They're the pride of the Imperial Navy, crewed by pilots who'd been training since the 1930s, guys who could land a plane on a moving carrier deck in a typhoon. The Japanese are bringing battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, the whole 9 yards. It's the kind of force that should absolutely crush whatever America can throw at it. But there's a problem brewing that Yamamoto doesn't see coming. See, the Japanese think their naval codes are unbreakable. They've got this system called JN-25, and they're convinced it's too complex for anyone to crack. What they don't know is that there's this brilliant cryptanalyst named Joseph Rochefort working at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, and this guy's a straight-up genius. He's been living on coffee and cigarettes, working 20-hour days with his team, slowly piecing together fragments of intercepted Japanese messages like the world's deadliest jigsaw puzzle. And he's about to hand Admiral Nimitz the biggest intelligence gift in naval history. The stage is set for something massive. Japan's coming with overwhelming force, absolutely confident in their superiority. America's reeling from 6 months of defeats, trying to figure out how to stop this Japanese juggernaut with a Pacific fleet that's still recovering from Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto thinks he's about to finish what he started on December 7th. But what he doesn't realize is that the Americans know he's coming. They know where, they know when, and they're preparing the ultimate surprise. The hunter's about to become the hunted, and the next few days are going to change everything. Let me tell you about a guy who probably saved more American lives than any general or admiral in the Pacific War, but most people have never even heard his name. Joseph Rochefort was a Navy cryptanalyst who worked in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, in a place they called Station Hypo. This wasn't some fancy high-tech operation. We're talking about a hot, cramped, windowless dungeon where guys worked in their bathrobes and slippers because it was so damn uncomfortable. Rochefort himself would show up in a smoking jacket and slippers, looking more like he was heading to bed than fighting a war. But don't let that fool you. This man and his team were about to pull off one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history. Now here's what made Rochefort special. He wasn't just a code breaker, he was a linguist who'd spent years in Japan, spoke fluent Japanese, and understood how Japanese naval officers thought. That cultural insight was absolutely critical, because breaking codes isn't just about math and patterns. It's about understanding context, military doctrine, and even personality quirks of the people writing the messages. When you're staring at fragments of intercepted radio traffic that's partially decoded, You need to fill in the blanks with educated guesses based on what makes sense in that culture's military mindset. Rochefort could do that better than almost anyone alive. The Japanese naval code JN-25 was incredibly complex. We're talking about a system that used thousands of 5-digit number groups that represented words, phrases, or syllables, all scrambled with an additive cipher. Imagine trying to solve a crossword puzzle where 60% of the letters are missing, half the clues are in a foreign language, and you're doing it while knowing that people's lives depend on getting it right. That's what Rochefort's team was dealing with every single day. They'd pick up Japanese radio transmissions, write down the coded groups, compare them to previous messages, look for patterns, test hypotheses, and slowly, painfully slowly, build up their understanding of what the enemy was planning. By late April and early May 1942, Rochefort's team started noticing something big brewing. Japanese radio traffic was spiking like crazy, with tons of messages about a major upcoming operation. They'd already partially broken enough of JN-25 to catch fragments, references to carriers, battleships, invasion forces, and occupation troops all being coordinated for something huge. But there was a problem. The Japanese were using a 2-letter designator for the target location, and that designator was AF. The question that could determine the fate of the Pacific War was simple but critical. What the hell is AF? Some intelligence analysts in Washington thought AF might be the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska. Others thought it could be Hawaii itself, or maybe even the west coast of the United States. Rochefort, though, had a hunch it was Midway Atoll, based on context clues from the messages and the types of forces being mentioned. But a hunch isn't good enough when you're asking Admiral Nimitz to commit America's precious few remaining aircraft carriers to a specific location. Nimitz needed proof, not guesses. So Rochefort came up with a brilliant trick that's straight out of a spy movie. And it actually worked. Here's what they did. Rochefort coordinated with Midway's commander to send an uncoded radio message saying that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down, and they were running low on fresh water. This was completely fake, of course, but they broadcast it in the clear, knowing Japanese listening posts would pick it up. Then they waited. Sure enough, within days, they intercepted a Japanese message saying, AF is short of water. Boom. Confirmation. Midway was the target. Rochefort had just pulled off one of the slickest intelligence moves in history, and now Nimitz knew exactly where to position his carriers for the ambush. But knowing where the attack's coming isn't enough. You need to know when. Rochefort's team kept grinding through intercepts, and they pinpointed the date. Early June, probably around the 4th or 5th. They even figured out the Japanese order of battle. How many carriers, which ones specifically, what kind of support ships, the whole layout. Think about how insane this is. The Americans basically had Japan's entire battle plan laid out before them. It's like playing poker when you can see your opponent's cards. This wasn't just good intelligence work. This was intelligence work that changed the entire trajectory of the war. Now here's where it gets tricky. Not everyone in the Navy believed Rochefort. Some officers in Washington were skeptical, thinking maybe the Japanese were feeding false information to lure American carriers into a trap. There was legitimate debate about whether to trust these intercepts or not. But Admiral Nimitz, and this is why he was such a great commander, he trusted his intelligence people. He looked Rochefort in the eye and said, essentially, I'm betting everything on your analysis. And that decision to trust human intelligence over second-guessing and bureaucratic caution, that's leadership at its finest, the kind that wins wars. Nimitz started moving his pieces on the chessboard based on Rochefort's intelligence. He recalled the carriers Enterprise and Hornet from the South Pacific. He ordered repair crews to work around the clock to get the damaged Yorktown, which had been hit at the Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier, back into fighting shape in an impossible 48 hours instead of the 3 months it should have taken. Dry dock workers were literally welding patches while the ship was putting to sea. Every decision Nimitz made was based on Rochefort's intelligence. If Rochefort was wrong, America would lose its carriers and probably lose the Pacific War. No pressure, right? The beautiful irony here is that while Rochefort's working in his basement wearing a bathrobe, looking like some eccentric professor, He's essentially outsmarting the entire Japanese Imperial Navy's planning staff. The Japanese had no idea their codes were compromised. They thought their communications were secure, so they're radioing all their plans back and forth, completely unaware that the Americans are reading everything like it's the morning newspaper. And that overconfidence, that assumption of security, it's about to cost Japan everything. Because while Yamamoto's sailing toward Midway thinking he's about to spring the perfect trap, the real trap's already been set for him. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto wasn't just some run-of-the-mill military commander. This guy was a strategic genius who'd been planning naval operations since before most American pilots were even born. He was the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, and now he's cooking up what he thinks is the ultimate finishing move, Operation MI, the invasion of Midway. On paper, this plan looks absolutely flawless. He's bringing 6 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, including the massive Yamato, the biggest battleship ever built, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, invasion transports, submarines, the works. It's the kind of overwhelming force that should make the Americans surrender just by looking at it on a map. But here's where things get interesting. Yamamoto's making the same mistake that's killed countless brilliant strategists throughout history. He's planning for the battle he wants to fight, not the battle his enemy's actually going to give him. See, his whole strategy depends on surprise. He figures the Americans will be caught off guard, rush their carriers out from Pearl Harbor in a panic when they hear Midway's under attack, and then his superior force will ambush them and blow them out of the water. It's a solid plan, except for one tiny problem. The Americans already know he's coming. They know when, they know where, and they're already positioning their carriers for a counter-ambush. Yamamoto's walking into exactly the kind of trap he thinks he's setting for the Americans. Let me break down Yamamoto's plan because it's actually pretty clever, or it would be if the enemy didn't know about it. First, he's going to create a diversion by attacking the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska. The idea is to draw American attention and maybe some ships north, away from the real target. Then, his carriers under Admiral Nagumo are going to soften up Midway with airstrikes. Once Midway's defenses are smashed, invasion forces will land and capture the atoll. And here's the kicker. When American carriers rush to defend Midway, Yamamoto's overwhelming force will be waiting to destroy them. It's like setting up a mouse trap with cheese, except the mouse knows about the trap and is bringing its own traps to the party. Now, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo is the guy actually commanding the carrier strike force, and he's got his own set of problems. Nagumo's the same commander who led the Pearl Harbor attack, so he's experienced, but he's also cautious to the point of being indecisive. His carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, are crewed by the absolute best naval aviators in the world at that time. These Japanese pilots have been training for years. They've got real combat experience from China and the early Pacific campaigns, and they can pull off maneuvers that would make most American pilots crash into the ocean. But being good at execution doesn't mean your strategy's sound. Here's a tactical problem that's going to come back to haunt the Japanese. Nagumo's got to prepare his planes for 2 completely different missions at the same time. He needs some planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships, in case those American carriers show up, and other planes armed with high-explosive bombs for hitting land targets on Midway. The problem is you can't just snap your fingers and change what a plane's carrying. Rearming and refueling aircraft on a carrier deck takes time. We're talking about hauling heavy ordnance around, disconnecting bombs, attaching different weapons, pumping fuel. And while you're doing all that, your planes are just sitting there on deck, vulnerable as hell. Yamamoto's also splitting his forces, which is like military strategy 101 of what not to do. He's got his carriers in one group, his battleships way back in another group, including himself on the Yamato, invasion forces in a third group, and the Aleutian diversion force way up north. The idea is that this complex coordination will confuse the Americans and give Japan overwhelming force at the decisive point. But in reality, what it means is that when things go sideways, and they're about to go really sideways, none of these groups can support each other. Yamamoto's sitting on the most powerful battleship ever built, but he's going to be too far away to help his carriers when they need him most. There's also this cultural factor at play that Western historians don't always emphasize enough. The Japanese Navy had an almost religious belief in the superiority of their fighting spirit. They genuinely thought that their Bushido code, their warrior ethos, their willingness to die for the Emperor, that all of this spiritual stuff would overcome material disadvantages. And look, there's something to be said for morale and fighting spirit. But when you're up against an enemy that's got better intelligence, numerical advantages in some areas, and most importantly knows you're coming, spirit alone isn't going to cut it. The Japanese were preparing for a battle they expected to dominate. The Americans were preparing for a battle they desperately needed to win. Another critical piece of Yamamoto's overconfidence. He's assuming the Americans only have 2 carriers in the Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet. Japanese intelligence told him that the Yorktown got heavily damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea a month earlier and would be out of action for months. What they don't know is that Pearl Harbor's repair crews pulled off a miracle, working around the clock with welders, electricians, and mechanics practically living on that ship to get her battle ready in 3 days. So Yamamoto's planning for a 4-2 carrier advantage, when in reality he's looking at 4-3. That might not sound like a huge difference, but in carrier warfare, every flight deck matters. 1 extra carrier means dozens more planes, and those extra planes are going to make all the difference. The Japanese are also suffering from what psychologists call confirmation bias. They're seeing what they expect to see instead of what's actually there. Their submarines are supposed to set up a picket line to spot American carriers leaving Pearl Harbor, but the Americans had already left before the submarines got into position. Japanese search planes should have found the American fleet, but they're looking in the wrong places because they don't believe the Americans would already be at Midway. Every piece of evidence that contradicts their assumptions gets dismissed or explained away. It's like when you're so convinced you're right about something that you ignore all the warning signs telling you you're wrong. Yamamoto's sitting there on the Yamato, hundreds of miles behind his carriers, thinking everything's going according to plan. Admiral Nagumo's approaching Midway, ready to launch his attack. The invasion forces are on schedule. The whole massive machine of Japanese naval power is moving toward what they think is inevitable victory. What they don't realize is that 3 American carriers are already waiting for them, hidden over the horizon, with pilots who've been briefed on exactly where the Japanese fleet will be. The hunters have become the hunted, and the perfect plan is about to run headfirst into reality. Admiral Chester Nimitz was the kind of leader who didn't waste time on panic or drama. He was all about cold, calculated decisions based on the best information available. When Rochefort walked into his office and laid out the intelligence about Midway, Nimitz didn't question it, didn't second-guess it, didn't form a committee to debate it. He looked at the evidence, trusted his people, and made the call. We're setting a trap. That's the mark of a great commander. Knowing when to trust your intelligence officers, even when the stakes are literally the entire Pacific War. Nimitz understood that this was America's chance to turn the tables, and he wasn't going to blow it by overthinking or playing it safe. Now, let's talk about what Nimitz was working with, because it wasn't exactly a powerhouse fleet. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. That's it. 3 carriers against Japan's 4 at Midway, plus their overall superior naval strength. But Nimitz had something the Japanese didn't: perfect intelligence and the element of surprise. He knew exactly where Yamamoto's carriers would be, what direction they'd approach from, and roughly when they'd launch their attack on Midway. It's like knowing the exact time and place a bank robber's gonna show up, so you can have cops waiting in position. The question wasn't whether to fight, it was how to maximize every advantage. Nimitz positioned his carriers about 200 miles northeast of Midway, a spot called Point Luck. Whoever came up with that name had a sense of humor, because luck was definitely going to play a role in what was about to happen. The carriers were hidden over the horizon, completely invisible to Japanese search planes unless they flew directly overhead. This positioning was genius, because it put the Americans upwind of where they expected the Japanese carriers to be, which meant American planes could take off more easily and cover more distance. Meanwhile, Nimitz reinforced Midway itself with every plane he could scrape together: B-17 bombers, marine fighters, patrol boats, even some outdated aircraft that had no business being in a modern war. Midway wasn't going to win the battle, but it could soften up the Japanese and serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The repair job on Yorktown deserves its own movie, honestly. This carrier took bomb and torpedo hits at the Coral Sea, and under normal circumstances, she'd need 3 months in a proper naval shipyard for repairs. But Nimitz didn't have 3 months. He barely had 3 days. So he ordered Pearl Harbor's repair crews to do the impossible. These guys worked 72 hours straight, welding steel plates over holes, fixing electrical systems, patching up the flight deck, working in shifts around the clock. Some of them literally didn't go home. They just grabbed a couple hours of sleep on the ship and got back to work. When Yorktown left Pearl Harbor, there were still repair crews on board, welding and fixing things as the ship steamed toward Midway. That's American industrial grit right there. Nimitz also made a crucial personnel decision that a lot of commanders wouldn't have had the guts to make. Admiral William Bull Halsey, who was supposed to command the carriers, came down with a severe skin condition and had to be hospitalized. Halsey recommended his cruiser commander, Raymond Spruance, as his replacement. Spruance was a cruiser guy, not a carrier expert, which made some people nervous, but Nimitz trusted Halsey's judgment and gave Spruance the job. That decision, putting a relatively unknown officer in command of America's most precious assets at the most critical moment, took serious confidence. And Spruance was about to prove he deserved that trust by making some of the best tactical decisions in naval history. The Americans had another advantage that doesn't get talked about enough. Their damage control training was way better than the Japanese. American carriers had dedicated damage control teams, firefighting equipment, and procedures that sailors drilled on constantly. Japanese carriers, for all their offensive power, were actually pretty vulnerable to fire because they stored aviation fuel and ordnance less safely than the Americans did. This difference in safety culture and training was going to become critically important when bombs started falling. The Americans knew how to save a damaged ship. The Japanese were better at fighting with an undamaged one. Nimitz's battle plan was straightforward but required perfect timing. Let the Japanese attack Midway first, which would reveal their position. Then, while their planes were returning and refueling, the American carriers would launch everything they had: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, in coordinated strikes to catch the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. On paper, it sounds simple. In practice, coordinating multiple carrier airstrikes across hundreds of miles of ocean with 1942 technology was incredibly difficult. Radio communication was spotty, navigation was done with compass and dead reckoning, and pilots had to find enemy ships that were moving at 30 knots across a featureless ocean. One wrong calculation, and the whole plan falls apart. Frank Jack Fletcher was the overall tactical commander since he was senior to Spruance, and he played his cards perfectly in the early stages. He kept the American carriers undetected, waited for the Japanese to commit to their Midway attack, and then gave the order to launch strikes. But here's where human factors start mattering. Coordinating 3 carriers to launch strikes at the same time is like trying to get 3 different orchestras to play the same symphony in perfect sync when they can't hear each other. Enterprise and Hornet launched their planes at different times. Yorktown launched later, and the squadrons got separated in the air. What was supposed to be a coordinated hammer blow turned into scattered piecemeal attacks. And that lack of coordination? It's about to cost American lives in the most heartbreaking way possible. Nimitz also had to make a brutal calculation. How many losses was he willing to accept to win this battle? He knew, absolutely knew, that American torpedo bombers were flying death traps. The Douglas TBD Devastator was slow, poorly armed, and had to fly low and straight to drop torpedoes, making them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Sending those planes against Japanese carriers was basically sending those crews to their deaths. But Nimitz needed those torpedo bombers to draw Japanese fighters down to low altitude, which would leave the high altitude clear for dive bombers to attack. It was a sacrifice play, and everybody involved knew it. That's the dark side of military leadership. Sometimes you have to send people into situations where they probably won't come back. The stage was set, the pieces were in position, and the morning of June 4th, 1942 was about to dawn. 3 American carriers sat waiting in the pre-dawn darkness, their crews at battle stations, pilots getting briefed on their targets, flight deck crews preparing planes for launch. Nobody knew exactly how this was going to go down, but everybody knew this was it. This was the moment that would decide whether America could stop Japan's advance or whether the Pacific would become a Japanese lake for years to come. Nimitz had done everything possible with the resources he had. He'd positioned his forces perfectly, trusted his intelligence, chosen good commanders, and prepared his people for battle. Now it all came down to execution, courage, and yeah, maybe a little bit of luck. Early morning on June 4th, 1942, and the American carriers are buzzing with activity like a kicked anthill. Pilots are climbing into cockpits, mechanics are doing final checks, and everybody knows that in the next few hours, some of these guys aren't coming back. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers are lined up on the flight decks, and if you knew anything about these planes, you'd realize these pilots are basically volunteering for a suicide mission. The Devastator was already outdated when the war started. It's slow, maxing out at about 115 mph with a torpedo attached, and it's got to fly low and straight for at least 30 seconds to drop its torpedo properly. Against Japanese Zeros and coordinated anti-aircraft fire, that's an eternity. It's like trying to rob a bank by walking through the front door in slow motion while everyone's shooting at you. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron was leading Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the Hornet, and this guy knew exactly what he was flying into. The night before the battle, he'd written a message to his squadron that's absolutely chilling when you know what happened next. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. Think about that for a second. He's not talking about maybe taking casualties. He's preparing his men for total annihilation. And these weren't naive kids. These were trained naval aviators who understood the odds. They knew the Devastator's weaknesses. They knew Japanese fighters would tear them apart, and they climbed into those cockpits anyway. That's not bravery. That's something beyond bravery. Waldron led his 15 Devastators toward the Japanese carriers without fighter escort because coordination between squadrons had completely broken down. The fighters got separated, the dive bombers went a different direction, and VT-8 ended up completely alone, heading straight for 4 Japanese carriers defended by dozens of Zeros and massive anti-aircraft fire. It's like showing up to a gunfight with a knife, except the knife is also on fire and falling apart. When Waldron spotted the Japanese carriers, he didn't hesitate. He led his squadron straight in for the attack. And the Japanese fighters swarmed them like sharks sensing blood in the water. What happened next is one of the most one-sided slaughters in naval aviation history, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. Japanese Zeros came screaming down from altitude, their 20mm cannons and machine guns ripping through the slow-moving Devastators. The American planes started exploding and splashing into the ocean one after another. Some pilots tried to take evasive action, but when you're that slow and that low, there's nowhere to go. A few managed to launch their torpedoes before getting shot down, but none of the torpedoes hit. They either missed, malfunctioned, or the Japanese ships maneuvered away. Within minutes, all 15 planes of Torpedo Squadron 8 were destroyed. 15 planes, 30 men, and only one survivor. Ensign George Gay, who got shot down, survived the crash, and spent the rest of the battle floating in the water, watching everything unfold. But VT-8 wasn't alone in their sacrifice. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed them in, and they got slaughtered too. VT-6 lost 10 out of 14 planes. VT-3 lost 10 out of 12. We're talking about American torpedo squadrons taking 80–90% casualties in a matter of minutes. These guys watched their buddies getting blown out of the sky, saw the ocean littered with burning wreckage, and they kept pressing their attacks anyway. Some of them got close enough to drop torpedoes, others got shot down before they could release. And just like VT-8, almost none of their torpedoes hit, because Japanese destroyers were throwing up walls of anti-aircraft fire, and the carriers were zigzagging all over the place. Now here's the thing that's going to make you respect these pilots even more. They knew they probably weren't going to survive, but they also knew their job wasn't just to sink carriers. It was to distract the Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft crews long enough for the dive bombers to get through. It's called a diversion attack, and it's one of the most brutal tactics in warfare because the guys doing the diverting are basically signing their own death warrants. Every Zero that was busy chasing down a torpedo bomber was a Zero that wasn't climbing up to attack the dive bombers at high altitude. Every anti-aircraft gun pointed at a low-flying Devastator was a gun that wasn't tracking the dauntless dive bombers coming in from above. These torpedo squadron guys were drawing fire intentionally, buying time with their lives. Think about what's going through George Gay's head as he's floating in the water, watching this massacre. He's the only survivor from his entire squadron. He's got a seat cushion keeping him afloat. He's surrounded by wreckage and bodies of his friends, and Japanese ships are cruising all around him. But he's also got a front row seat to what happens next, and what he sees is going to give meaning to all those deaths. Because while the Japanese fighters are down at low altitude, wiping out the torpedo bombers and celebrating their easy victories, they're not paying attention to what's happening at 14,000 feet above them. The dive bombers are getting into position, and nobody's stopping them. The sacrifice of those torpedo squadrons created a window, a brief, precious window of opportunity where Japanese fighters were out of position and Japanese carriers were focused on the wrong threat. If the torpedo bombers hadn't attacked first, the dive bombers would have faced those Zeros at altitude, and the whole attack might have failed. It's like the torpedo guys kicked down the front door, took all the bullets, and created chaos that let the dive bombers sneak in through the back. That's not how anyone planned it. The attacks were supposed to be coordinated, simultaneous, but the screw-up in coordination accidentally created the perfect setup for what came next. Here's what makes this even more tragic. Most of these torpedo pilots died thinking they'd failed. They didn't sink anything, their torpedoes didn't hit, and they got massacred for seemingly nothing. They went down believing their sacrifice was wasted. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know as they were crashing into the Pacific, was that they'd just made the most important contribution to American victory at Midway. Their attack pulled Japanese fighters and attention exactly where it needed to be, creating the opening that was about to change everything. They died heroes, even if they didn't live long enough to see it. The Japanese carrier crews were feeling pretty good at this point. They just wiped out wave after wave of American torpedo bombers with minimal damage to their own ships. The Americans seemed disorganized, their attacks were uncoordinated, and their torpedoes weren't working properly. Admiral Nagumo's carriers were in the middle of rearming and refueling planes on their flight decks, getting ready to launch another strike. Everything seemed under control. The Japanese fighter pilots were landing back on their carriers, probably congratulating each other on easy kills. What none of them realized was that American dive bombers were already in their final approach, diving out of the sun, and in about 5 minutes, the entire balance of power in the Pacific was about to shift. It's around 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, and the Japanese carriers are at their most vulnerable moment, and they don't even know it. Picture this. The flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are absolutely packed with planes being refueled and rearmed. There are fuel hoses snaking across the deck, ordnance carts loaded with bombs and torpedoes, mechanics working frantically to get aircraft ready for the next strike. It's organized chaos, and if you know anything about carrier operations, you know this is the absolute worst time to get attacked. Those flight decks are basically floating gas stations loaded with explosives. One spark in the wrong place and the whole ship becomes a fireball. Admiral Nagumo's dealing with what military strategists call a decision dilemma, and he's about to make the wrong choice at the worst possible time. He'd launched planes to attack Midway earlier that morning, and now those planes are coming back needing to land. But he's also got planes on deck armed with ship-killing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, just in case American carriers show up. Here's his problem. Should he launch the anti-ship planes immediately to attack the American carriers that scout planes just spotted, or should he recover his Midway strike force first? He decides to recover the Midway planes, which means the anti-ship aircraft have to be moved below deck, rearmed with different weapons and brought back up. That decision, that one choice to prioritize recovering planes over launching an immediate strike, it's gonna cost Japan the war. While all this deck-shuffling chaos is happening, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from Enterprise is leading his dive bomber squadron through the sky, desperately searching for the Japanese carriers. He'd flown to where they were supposed to be, but the ocean was empty. The Japanese had changed course. McCluskey's got a choice. Turn back to his carrier before he runs out of fuel, or keep searching and risk ditching in the ocean. Most commanders would have played it safe and turned back. McCluskey keeps searching, and then he spots something beautiful. A Japanese destroyer racing northeast at full speed, leaving a white wake across the blue ocean. That destroyer's heading somewhere important, and McCluskey follows it like a bloodhound on a scent. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown is approaching the Japanese fleet from a different direction with his dive bombers. Due to the communication screw-ups and navigation errors, the American squadrons that were supposed to attack together are arriving separately, spread out over time. But here's where luck, or divine intervention depending on how you look at it, enters the picture. Because of these timing accidents, McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers and Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers are going to hit the Japanese carriers at almost the exact same moment from different directions. The Japanese combat air patrol can't be everywhere at once, and their fighters are still down low, dealing with the last of the torpedo bombers. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's dive bombers reach their roll-in point. He's looking down from 14,000 feet, and there they are. 3 Japanese carriers in formation, flight decks crammed with planes, sitting ducks. This is the moment every dive bomber pilot trains for, the perfect setup. McCluskey doesn't hesitate. He tips his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a near-vertical dive, and his squadron follows him down. Imagine the sight. Dozens of American dive bombers coming screaming out of the sky at nearly 300 mph. Their dive brakes extended, pilots fighting the controls as they aim for specific points on those carrier decks below. The Japanese are so focused on the low-level threats that they don't see the high-altitude attack coming until it's too late. The Dauntless dive bomber was an absolute beast of an aircraft for this kind of attack. It could dive at steep angles, we're talking 70 degrees or more, giving pilots a clear view of their target and making it incredibly hard for anti-aircraft fire to track them. The plane was stable in the dive, which meant pilots could aim accurately even while plummeting toward the deck at terminal velocity. And it carried a 1,000-pound bomb that could penetrate a carrier's flight deck and explode deep inside the ship. When you combine all that with pilots who'd trained for months on dive bombing techniques, you've got a precision weapon that's about to prove devastating. McCluskey's bombers hit the Akagi and Kaga almost simultaneously. Bombs come crashing through flight decks, exploding among parked aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, takes a direct hit that ignites planes on the hangar deck. Within seconds, the ship's engulfed in flames. Secondary explosions start going off as stored ordnance cooks off in the heat. Kaga gets hit even worse. Multiple bombs punch through her flight deck, starting fires that spread out of control almost immediately. The Japanese damage control teams try to fight the fires, but it's hopeless. There's too much fuel, too many explosives, too much flammable material all packed together. These carriers are doomed, and everybody on board knows it. Leslie's Yorktown bombers hit the Soryu at the same time, and she goes up like a Roman candle. 3 bombs in quick succession turn her flight deck into an inferno. The ship's captain tries to maintain control, but fires are raging below decks. Explosions are tearing the ship apart from the inside, and there's no way to save her. In the span of 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers at Midway have been mortally wounded. The ships that represented Japan's offensive power in the Pacific, crewed by the most experienced naval aviators in the world, are burning wrecks. It's one of the most sudden and dramatic reversals in military history. The Japanese are in shock. Admiral Nagumo's standing on Akagi's bridge, watching his flagship burn, and he's got to transfer to a cruiser because his carrier's uninhabitable. The coordinated Japanese attack machine that seemed unstoppable just minutes ago is now completely disrupted. Pilots who survived the deck fires are floating in the water. Trained mechanics and deck crews are burned or killed. The institutional knowledge, the experience, the expertise that Japan had built up over years of training, it's going up in smoke. You can replace ships eventually, but you can't replace trained personnel quickly. Japan's losing its most valuable asset, experienced people. But the battle's not over yet. One Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, is still operational and fighting mad. She's been separated from the other carriers, which is why she escaped the initial dive bomber attack. Her captain's already launching a counterstrike against the American carriers, and he's got revenge on his mind. The Americans just pulled off the most devastating carrier strike in history, but the Japanese still have enough firepower left to hit back hard. And hit back they will, targeting the one American carrier that's about to pay the price for this victory. The Hiryu wasn't about to go down without a fight, and her captain, Tamon Yamaguchi, was one of the most aggressive and capable commanders in the Japanese Navy. While his 3 sister carriers were burning, he launched every plane he had left, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, straight at the American fleet. His pilots knew they were probably flying one-way missions, but they didn't hesitate. They found the Yorktown, and they hit her hard. Japanese dive bombers scored hits that started fires and knocked out her boilers. Then torpedo bombers came in and put 2 torpedoes into her side. The Yorktown, which had already survived the Battle of Coral Sea and gotten patched up in record time, was now listing heavily and dead in the water. Her crew started abandoning ship, thinking she was finished. For a moment, it looked like Japan might salvage something from this disaster. But here's the thing about American carriers. They were built tough and their damage control was next level. While Yorktown's crew was abandoning ship, damage control teams stayed behind, fighting fires, shoring up bulkheads, and trying to save her. They actually managed to stabilize the ship, and were starting to get her moving again when Japanese submarines showed up. The submarine I-168 found Yorktown being towed back to Pearl Harbor, put more torpedoes into her, and also sank the destroyer Hammond that was tied alongside helping with repairs. Yorktown finally went down on June 7th, but the fact that she survived multiple bombing runs, torpedo hits, and still took days to sink, that's testament to American shipbuilding and the skill of those damage control crews. They'd learned from Pearl Harbor, and those lessons were keeping ships alive. Meanwhile, American scout planes found the Hiryu, and Admiral Spruance wasn't going to make the same mistake the Japanese did. He didn't hesitate. He launched dive bombers from Enterprise, and they caught Hiryu just like they'd caught the other carriers, vulnerable, with planes on deck. The dauntless bombers screamed down and put 4 bombs into her. Within hours, Hiryu was a blazing wreck just like Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Captain Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship, choosing to go down with his vessel in the samurai tradition. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 of Japan's carriers at Midway were either sunk or sinking, and Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was absolutely shattered. Admiral Yamamoto, sitting on the Yamato hundreds of miles away, got the news and couldn't believe it. 4 carriers gone in one day? His entire strategic plan demolished in a matter of hours? He tried to salvage the situation by ordering his battleships to close with the American fleet for a night surface battle, where Japan's superior battleship force might win. But Spruance, and this shows his strategic brilliance, refused to take the bait. He withdrew to the east, protecting his carriers instead of risking them in a night fight against superior forces. Yamamoto had no choice but to call off the whole operation and retreat. The mighty Japanese fleet that had sailed to Midway with such confidence was now limping home in defeat, having lost 4 irreplaceable carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots. Let's talk about what this battle actually meant strategically, because it's way bigger than just America won a fight. Before Midway, Japan was on offense everywhere, expanding, conquering, pushing outward. After Midway, they were on defense for the rest of the war. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. Japan could still fight, and they would fiercely for 3 more years, but they could never regain the initiative. Every battle from here on out would be Japan trying to hold what they had, while America built up overwhelming force. Think about it like a chess game where you lose your queen and both rooks in one move. You can still play, but you're basically just delaying checkmate. The loss of those 4 carriers hurt Japan in ways that went beyond just hardware. Those ships carried the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, guys who'd been flying combat missions since the China campaigns in the 1930s. When those carriers sank, hundreds of pilots died or became prisoners of war. The institutional knowledge, the combat experience, the skill that takes years to develop, gone in a day. Japan could build new carriers, and they tried, but they couldn't replace experienced pilots quickly enough. American pilot training programs were pumping out thousands of aviators, and while they weren't as experienced initially, the US had the luxury of rotating pilots back home to train new ones. Japan didn't have that luxury, and it showed as the war went on. Here's something that doesn't get emphasized enough. Midway proved that intelligence wins wars just as much as firepower does. Rochefort's codebreakers gave America the ultimate advantage. knowing the enemy's plans before they executed them. After Midway, the US invested even more heavily in signals intelligence, code breaking, and electronic warfare. Meanwhile, Japan never realized their codes had been compromised. They kept using JN-25 and other systems that American cryptanalysts could read, giving the US continued advantages in subsequent battles. It's like playing poker when your opponent can see your cards but doesn't know you know. That intelligence edge paid dividends throughout the rest of the Pacific War. The strategic momentum shifted immediately after Midway. Just 2 months later, in August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan's doorstep. Before Midway, such an offensive would have been impossible because Japan's carrier force would have countered it. After Midway, Japan could only react defensively. Every island America took, every base established, every carrier built, and America was building them fast, Essex-class carriers were coming off assembly lines like cars, pushed Japan further back. The industrial giant that Yamamoto feared was fully awake now, and it was angry. There's also a psychological dimension to Midway's importance that military historians sometimes overlook. American morale had been in the dumps after Pearl Harbor and 6 months of defeats. Newspapers were full of bad news, families were worried, and there was genuine fear that Japan might be unstoppable. Midway changed that narrative overnight. Suddenly, Americans had proof that Japan could be beaten, that American technology and fighting spirit could triumph against supposedly superior enemy forces. Recruitment went up, war bond sales increased, and factory workers pushed harder because they believed their efforts mattered. On the flip side, Japanese morale took a hit. The government tried to hide the extent of the Midway losses from the public, but the military knew, and doubts started creeping in. If you look at the Pacific War on a timeline, Midway is the hinge point where everything turns. Before, Japanese expansion, Allied retreat. After, American advance, Japanese contraction. The specific battles changed: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, but the overall trajectory was set at Midway. Yamamoto had been right when he said he could run wild for 6 months. Pearl Harbor happened on December 7, 1941. Midway happened on June 4, 1942. Almost exactly 6 months. After that, Japan was playing defense with dwindling resources against an enemy with effectively unlimited industrial capacity. The mathematics of attrition warfare meant Japan couldn't win a long fight, and Midway guaranteed it would be a long fight. The war wouldn't end for another 3 years, and there would be brutal battles ahead. But the outcome? That was decided in 5 minutes over the Pacific on a June morning in 1942. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The Battle of Midway wasn't won by the biggest guns or the most ships. It was won by intelligence, guts, and people willing to sacrifice everything for something bigger than themselves. Those code breakers grinding away in basement offices, those torpedo pilots flying straight into hell knowing they probably wouldn't come back, those repair crews welding the Yorktown back together in 72 hours, they all understood something crucial. When the stakes are that high, you don't wait for perfect conditions. You use what you've got, you trust your people, and you execute with everything you have. Now let me ask you something. What's your Midway moment? What's that challenge in your life where the odds look impossible, where everyone's counting you out, where it seems like the enemy, whether that's failure, fear, debt, whatever, has all the advantages? Because here's the truth those dive bomber pilots proved. You don't need to have more resources than your opponent. You need better intelligence, better timing, and the courage to commit fully when the moment comes. Nimitz didn't have the biggest fleet. He had the right information and the guts to act on it. Those torpedo squadrons didn't have the best planes. They had the courage to create an opening for others. What advantages are you overlooking? What intelligence do you have that you're not using? What sacrifice are you avoiding that might be exactly what creates your breakthrough? Think about this. The Japanese made one critical mistake at Midway. They hesitated. Nagumo had the chance to launch his strike immediately, but he paused, reorganized, tried to make everything perfect. That hesitation cost him everything. How many times do we do the same thing? We wait for perfect conditions, perfect timing, perfect preparation. And while we're waiting, the opportunity slips away. The Americans weren't perfect at Midway. Their attacks were uncoordinated, their torpedoes didn't work, their squadrons got separated, but they attacked anyway, and that imperfect action beat perfect planning every single time. What are you waiting for perfect conditions to do? What would happen if you just launched your attack right now, messy as it might be? Here's another question. Are you willing to be the torpedo bomber squadron? Are you willing to do the hard, dangerous, seemingly thankless work that creates opportunities for others, even if you don't get the credit? Those pilots died thinking they'd failed, not knowing they'd set up the winning blow. How often do we avoid difficult tasks because we can't see the immediate payoff? Your current struggle, your current sacrifice. What if it's setting up your own breakthrough 5 minutes from now, and you just can't see it yet? What if the hard work you're doing right now is drawing the enemy fighters down low so your dive bombers can get through? And here's the big one. What codes do you need to break in your own life? Rochefort and his team didn't just accept that Japanese communications were unreadable. They worked obsessively until they cracked the system. What problems are you treating as unsolvable that might just need more persistence, different approaches, smarter analysis? What intelligence is available to you that you're not using because you haven't put in the work to decode it? Success leaves clues, just like those Japanese radio transmissions left patterns. Are you paying attention? So I'm going to challenge you right now. Pick one area of your life where you're on defense, where you're reacting instead of attacking, where you're letting circumstances dictate the terms of engagement. Now flip the script. What would it look like to set an ambush? To use intelligence instead of just force? To coordinate your resources, time, money, skills, relationships into one decisive strike instead of scattered, ineffective attacks? Because that's what Midway teaches us. Concentrated force at the decisive point, based on superior information, executed with courage. That's how you win against superior opponents. The battle's not over in your life, is it? You've still got fights ahead, challenges coming, moments where you'll have to choose between playing it safe and going all in. So what's it gonna be? Are you gonna be Nagumo, hesitating at the critical moment, trying to make everything perfect while opportunity slips away? Or are you gonna be Spruance, trusting your intelligence, committing your forces, and striking when the moment's right, even if conditions aren't perfect? Are you going to be those torpedo pilots doing the hard work that nobody sees to create openings for breakthrough? Or are you going to be those dive bomber pilots recognizing the perfect moment and executing flawlessly when it comes? Now here's what I want you to do. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started with stories like this. Stories about intelligence overcoming brute force, courage defeating the odds, and decisive moments that change everything. Drop a comment below. What's your biggest takeaway from Midway? What area of your life needs a Midway-style turnaround? What hesitation do you need to overcome? Let's build a community of people who study history not just to know what happened, but to learn how to win our own battles. Because the lessons from Midway aren't just about carriers and dive bombers, they're about how ordinary people facing impossible odds can change the world in 5 minutes when they've got the right intelligence, the right timing, and the courage to act. Now get out there and turn your tide.